We'll presume that we're going to be in any second now. Good. Well, hi, Kathy. It's great to see you. I'm just going to check to make sure that we're going to be live in the group.
Oh, my phone's telling me that we're live.
Oh, we are live. Brilliant. Oh, hi, Kathy. Great to see you. Thanks for coming along today, this afternoon.
And you? Yeah, good to see you again. Haven't seen you for a while.
No, we haven't. And before we start then, hi to everybody. We've got the amazing Kathy who's going to be chatting with me this afternoon. Kathy and I, we go way back a bit, don't we? It's been a while, I guess, and we've done quite a few bits and pieces together. So I know this is going to be fun today, and we've got a lot of things we want to talk about. So Kathy, for those who don't know you, can you just start off by just telling us a little bit about what you do and your background?
So I'm the director of Barking Brains, which is a neuroscience outreach education platform. So essentially, I'm a veterinary surgeon and a neuroscientist, and I've got an interest in dog behaviour. So I kind of merge all of those to provide the training and behaviour community with neuroscientific information, but in a kind of practical form. So through examples, using my own dogs, etc., explaining what's going on with their behaviour. So yeah, I guess in my day-to-day job, I'm kind of busy being a neuroscientist and a vet and a veterinary anaesthetist and founder of Ethics First. So I'm a campaigner for ethical structures and frameworks within clinical practice for veterinary medicine. Well, I'm also involved in the UK Dog Charter, thanks to you, I believe, right in the beginning. So I sit on the what do you call it? The gosh, I can't even think of my words now.
Yeah, the oversight committee.
Oversight committee. That's right. So again, that's my interest in ethics and ethical frameworks. So yeah, a few fingers in pies. But I guess I've always been interested in behaviour, not just dog behaviour, but psychology and neuroscience generally since I was a little kid.
So and how you find time to put all that together, that's what happens with our lives, right? We just keep on adding these things. They're almost like a rolling ball that just keeps attracting things, don't we?
Yeah, I have no idea.
So if I'm looking over to the right, so that people know, it's because I'm checking in the group just to make sure everybody can hear us. And so hi to everybody. Hi to Simon, Nicola, Lindsay, Julie, Diane there. And also if I'm looking down, I'm making notes. So just to make sure people know I'm not being rude to you and checking last night's lottery results or something like that. So veterinary came first then, Kathy. So the veterinary side of things came first, I guess.
Yeah, as soon as I could speak, then people would say, what do you want to be? And I'd say a vet. And they'd say, oh, you'll change your mind. You've got lots of years to go. And apparently I'm just not very imaginative because I never changed my mind.
Well, it's good to kind of have that single-minded view of things, isn't it? And what was it that got you the interest in the neuroscience? Where did that come from?
So I guess ever since I was a little kid, so as young as 8 or 9, I can remember reading books that were about psychology. So not necessarily textbooks, but kind of novels that were about psychology or personal stories that were about kind of early life experience and the impact on adult psychology, etc. And that continued throughout my teens. So I think I've always had an interest in what makes us tick. And I've always had a very strong bond with animals. I'm probably not the only person that finds them easier than most people. They're kind of my go-to happy place, straightforward relationships, right? And yeah, I can remember when I was like 13, 14, 15, kind of thinking about that dynamic, you know, what's different between a human-animal bond and a human-human bond and an animal-animal bond. So yeah, at the time I was very much, committed to being a veterinary surgeon and to being a first opinion veterinary surgeon. So, you know, working in first opinion practice, which I loved. But I guess at some point it just wasn't intellectually stimulating enough for me, and I still had lots of outstanding questions about the brain and behaviour, and that's kind of how I morphed into deciding to do a PhD in neuroscience. It came out of my clinical work, And essentially I came across clinical questions that I couldn't answer because the research wasn't there. And someone, I think the wonderful Dr. Polly Taylor said, well, if the research isn't there, why don't you do it? So that's kind of how that happened.
Did that focus in, excuse me, did you focus in on a lot of human-based science and evidence-based work first and then start to extrapolate through to animals, or is there enough on the animal side of things for you to start looking at and then building through from there?
I guess for me, I'm interested in fundamental research more than I am applied research. I'm interested in how does the healthy brain work? Like, you know, what are the mechanisms that surround our behavior and our interactions? So for that, I don't really see a clear separation between humans and other animals. I see the same amount of separation between humans and apes and primates and other species, dogs and pigs. And, you know, there are species differences, but in the world of fundamental neuroscience, I don't see a huge delineation between humans and other animals, except for the ability to speak, so language. And that's obviously a very clear distinction between the two, and is interesting in its own right, because language has led to cognitive development that other species haven't been capable of because they don't possess language. It gives us a unique ability to communicate and therefore control the world around us, as opposed to just interact with the world around us. But yeah, I don't see it quite in the way that other people, I guess the popular press, you know, would talk about human psychology versus animal psychology, whereas to me, it's just a continuum in lots of senses.
And this is a really important message, isn't it? Because, you know, what we know, as you know, I talk about and try and unpack this notion of the emotional experience and recognize the two sides of that. One, that we all have one, and two, even you and I as the same species, our emotional experience will be unique and specific to us as an individual. But recognizing how much we do share neurologically and physiologically with the dog, and how a lot of that neurological function will have the same output about seeking safety, seeking connections, being able to process without the nervous system hijacking that process sometimes. I use my doors of the brain analogy, which I use with my clients, about keeping as many doors open as possible. And all these things are relevant regardless of species. So I think this is just really important when we think about some of the views in the past that, well, because we don't know about what an animal might feel or their emotional responses or their level of emotionality, we're just going to purely focus on observable behavioral output. We're missing so much by having that narrow view, aren't we? Especially when you think about what you're saying regarding the connections through neuroscience.
For sure. And I mean, if you look at the history of neuroscience over the last sort of 50 years or so, I mean, even sadly, the last 25, 30 years or so, it wasn't until relatively recently that we actually accepted that non-verbal humans have the same emotional experience as verbal humans. Like, that's how recent in the thousands of years of history of humankind our understanding of experience, internal experience, emotional experience is. And in terms of separation between the species, we're pushing the boundaries all of the time. So every 2 or 3 years, we decide we've got sufficient evidence to say that yet another species or type of species does have emotional experience, because now we can prove it. It's like this obsession, our human obsession with, if we can't prove it, it doesn't exist, instead of just accepting that in all likelihood, if the hardware is there, then it's certainly very possible that those species do have emotional experience. So I think I'm perhaps more open-minded than some in terms of what our animals experience, but it's encouraging to see that literally year on year we build evidence within the science community that is the case, that animals really do have complex internal states and complex emotional experiences, and they are as unique as the human experience.
And that it makes complete sense. It doesn't take a lot of academic knowledge to think, well, you know, Mother Nature has especially when we think about mammals specifically, and especially when we think about our connection with dogs, because there's multi-layers with dogs, of course, because we've got the initial neurology and physiology that's there, but also the thousands of years that we've built creating a social connection, and the transformation, the evolution of the dog to develop more social processing skills as part of that kind of evolution. But when we think about the brain processing things, once it's decided on something, it can't do much unless it makes you feel something. That's the whole point, really. So I think, but some of this comes back to, I think, obviously the human ego more generally, but also some of the biases, even within science, that are being, especially in the last 10 years or so, been kind of highlighted about, hang on, that's because you've got a male outlook and you're all males still doing it, or even ableism within some of these things. And this also has underpinned by speciesism in a way. It's like, well, and I think I definitely get a feeling, you all know better than I do, that within the kind of academic science community, that some of those barriers are starting to come down a little bit more now, and people are seeing beyond that a little bit.
I think at least they're being recognised. It's scientific endeavour is a huge machine, and complicated by all sorts of economic factors and lots of other complicated things that are going to take time to kind of shift around, I think. But it is now at least recognised that we've done the vast majority of psychological and neuroscience research on male subjects, whether that is humans or animals. But certainly the vast majority, and I really do mean the vast majority, so over 95% of the animal research has been done in males. Now, why? Because it's a lot more straightforward. Females cycle, and their behaviour responses, as well as their affective states, their internal states, both physiologically and emotionally, vary on that cycle. And that has been known about for a long time, and it causes difficulties because you get a lot of variation, which means that instead of using 12 animals per study, you're going to have to use, like, I don't know, 100 or whatever to be able to account for that variance. But of course, what we missed during all of that is that males do also have hormones, and they do also vary. They are different to females, and the data that's produced from the males is specific in some cases to males. So there are some data that will be applicable across the board, but increasingly we're finding that some of those data are actually specific to males. And you picked up on the EDI difficulty and bias when we look at research to produce drugs, so antidepressants or any drugs that influence mood or have a kind of psychophysiological effect. Those drugs aren't actually making it past animal research and into human trials because of the fact that we've selected for data that's produced from males, healthy males of a certain strain in the case of animals, or from a certain race if you're talking about people. So it's very specific, and it means that the data are very tightly packed and very similar, which is great in terms of saying, yeah, I've done my job, I've done a successful experiment and I found an effect, here's your new drug target. But of course, when you take that drug target and introduce it to a more wide-ranging population that might differ in its genetic background and differ in its behavioural responses and its neurotransmitter background and responses, then you find that actually there isn't as much effect there as there should be, and the drug isn't going to go forward to the clinic. What we understand more now, I think, about drug development is that what we need to do is understand those drugs that are successful in a very specific population. How do we make sure that we can bring those to market for a very specific population, whilst also supporting research that looks at the effects of other drug targets in other populations. So I didn't really mean to get into pharmacology and drug development, but it's really topical at the moment, and I think it is a really good example of where a lack of appreciation of our complete obsession with tunnel vision, trying to make everything as clean as possible and as absolute as possible, is actually to our detriment ultimately. And, you know, we're miles behind in neuroscience research compared to cardiac research, liver research, you know, so many other systems within the body we know so much more about. And part of that delay has been to do with those factors, to do with the fact that we haven't really appreciated that everybody's emotional experience is completely different and very, very unique and personal. And we can't go about investigating that in the same way as we do with other systems within the body.
And I think it's really helpful to go through some of that you've just gone through there, because therein lies the rub, right? That trying to look at things in a linear fashion, which is kind of what we've always done for quite a long time, and especially when we think in medicine, where we have individual disciplines. So you might go and see a specialist for this or a specialist for that. Actually recognizing the entirety of the emotional experience, including the physiology, the role of pain, the role of discomfort, how you process that yourself, how you process things neurologically, how you add value to things individually. That's where the real answers lie for that individual. And that's where the challenges are for science, which likes to kind of neatly put things into a more of a linear fashion of looking at things, and having a more holistic approach, which is definitely, I think that's the one thing that we're seeing in the dog behavior world now, all these different strands, many that have been there anyway, but pulling them together. You're doing a deep dive, we'll talk about this at the end, so you're going to be doing a deep dive with Hannah Capon and Bobby at Behavior Vets on the role of behavior and pain. There's a big focus on that at the moment. There's a big focus on the introduction of recognizing individual processing needs within behavior. There's a lot more recognition on the individual and about how we join those dots, and actually we need to have a multi-factorial approach, you know.
Yeah,
and that's where some of these complications come from, and I think it's difficult. We've almost got to reinvent, I think, again, I'm not an expert on the science side of things, but how we go about looking at this stuff, and where we look to get the data from in the future, and how we put those kind of studies together.
Yeah, and I think we have to keep an open mind. You know, there's a lot that we still don't know, a lot that we still don't understand, and there really aren't any quick fixes. If there were, then there wouldn't be so many cases that needed to be seen. So I think, you know, you hit the nail on the head when you said it's about having a multidisciplinary approach. And that's where I think it's really exciting in animal behavior, but particularly dog behavior right now, to have the amount of information that we've got out there. You know, through Hannah's page, we've got access to physiotherapists and to, you know, dog behaviorists that specialize in pain, or pain specialists, and, you know, all of these different disciplines. And there's so much free content out there now that I think it's really exciting to be in that space now, and to be thinking about how do we actually structure consultations and care packages, both for owners and for pets, that really are multidisciplinary, and that really don't just bowl in there and say, I can wave a magic wand and give you the fix, but actually I can support you along this journey of discovering what's going on here and discovering what it is that your pet needs. Because ultimately I believe that's what we need to be doing, is focus on fulfilling need. We don't need to focus on changing behavior, because if you fulfill the need, the behavior will be appropriate for the situation.
And that's that shift from the more traditional, talking dog training world side of things, task-orientated view of looking at things, to more of a care-orientated one, and looking at things in the round, and very much looking at the presentation of the animal in front of you, and looking at it from that kind of multimodal point of view. And I think the two things I think as an industry, as a community, that we have to put more emphasis on is, first of all, educating people to do better observations, really good, sound observations that aren't based upon pre-labeling or judgment. And secondly, communication skills, how we communicate that from the observations back to the caregiver, so that they can get a more rounded view of what their role is in that caregiving. So thinking about this then, Kathy, and yeah, so you have a really interesting outlook, I think, because you come from a veterinary side, so you understand a lot from that, and now you've understood a lot about the neuroscience, and then you've shifted to dogs specifically because that's a big passion. So when you open that door into the dog training world, what was it that really hit you? Because I know it was a struggle for you at first, because you were looking at what was going on more traditionally, and this isn't about what side of the fence you're on, methods and tools. It is about the kind of obsession with methods and tools, that kind of very heavy operant bias that we've had for a while. What were your first views on the industry when you first had a peek in?
Yeah, it was interesting. So I guess I came away with a few thoughts. So one of them was that although the dog world generally is almost obsessed with evidence and evidence-based and scientific endeavor and making sure there's science to support stuff, my experience is that it isn't evidence-based, and the science that is presented is often not what I would call science anyway. You can publish in a journal, that doesn't make it science. I'm sorry if that shocks some people, but it's true. It wasn't necessarily information that was well evidenced with what we call primary referencing, which goes back to solid referencing in fundamental science that have been reproduced and replicated many times over, which is essentially the process of science to prove that something's true, although we never really prove that something's true, but to increase the likelihood that something is true to such an extent that we don't need to study it anymore. We reproduce and replicate it over and over again in many different, with many different variables in many different situations. And if it comes out as true in all of those situations, we decide, okay, we're not going to put any more money into that now. We're just going to take that as a truth and then use that to move on to the next question in science. That's basically the process of science. And occasionally we get caught out. So occasionally we'll go back to something that everybody has thought has been true for a long period of time, like the world is flat, or any of those other things. And we get caught out and we say, okay, now we have to rethink everything again. But that doesn't happen very often. What tends to happen now, and I think it's probably driven by the media and the popular press, if I'm honest, is that people take one thing that may or may not have been true from a scientific publication. Usually it's not actually data, it's a researcher's opinion about their data, which in science, scientists understand that the discussion part of a paper is not true. That's just the scientists' ramblings about what they think of their data. The only truth are the numbers, the data, the quantitative or qualitative data, depending on what your discipline is. But those are the only factual parts of a paper. But quite often what the media and popular press will do is they'll take a tagline from the discussion, which is somebody's opinion on those data, and present that as if it's true. And then people run with it and Chinese whisper with it. And by the time it filters down to the dog world, there's some sort of weird truth in it somewhere along the way, but it's really skewed, really inappropriately applied. And sometimes that doesn't matter. So, in a lot of cases, if it's helping people to work with their dogs or helping people to have compassion for their dogs, then, it may not matter that it's not precisely correct. But sometimes it really does matter. And sometimes it really does make a big difference, because it might be validating techniques that actually aren't validated by scientific method, or it may be incorrectly presenting something as truth, which means that people exclude other possibilities. So instead of keeping an open mind, they decide, oh, well, that's the answer, that's what's going on here. And so you miss the opportunity to really appreciate the complexity of the situation. So I guess I kind of got intrigued by that. There are lots of people in the dog world that are very hungry for scientific information, but they're clearly not able to access it. Otherwise, there would be good quality science within the dog world. And I think, it's something that I think I can help with, that I would like to help with. It's something I'm interested in helping with. I like science communication, and I like the idea that we really can, science belongs to the public. The public pay for it ultimately, and it belongs to the public, but scientists make it very inaccessible to the public. And the media have come along and made it accessible in the most horrible, horrific way. So if I can somehow stand in the middle and facilitate science communication, then I think that would be a really good thing. Yeah, so yeah, I did see a lot of that. And of course, you know, there's good and bad that comes along with that. There's good in that people really love the content that I put out there, to the point where it surprised me. I had no intention of making barking brains a thing, but people were kind of hungry for information. So it was great that they're appreciating the information. And then there's bad. There's like the whole social media trolling, you know, being righteous, you know, all of that kind of malarkey that goes on. So it took me a while, probably a couple of years, to kind of work out how I was going to navigate that space. And mostly it involved deleting a lot of people on Facebook. That seemed overnight to solve the problem. And also not replying to all the comments on Barking Brains. If anything's just so obviously incorrect and the person said it like 6 times and they're ranting, I just delete and block them. And it works really well. But, you know, I went through lots of other more energetic solutions that had me go crazy first, like, you know, trying to bring everyone on board, which you're never going to do. I'm going to provide my content to people that want to listen to it, and people that don't want to listen to it need to go and spend their energy somewhere else.
I think all that's really important. I think this comes back to that thing we were talking about a bit off air before we came on, about absolutism. and it's interesting what you mentioned there about the kind of filtering down, because we have a bit of an obsession with learning theory as an industry. More traditionally, that's many people's first thing they get educated about, with a big specific view on operant and quadrants. And then I think because that really caught the eye of a lot of people who had positions of influence regarding education, a lot of other science then came through that filter. So we just end up with this cone. This is how I see it, and this is why I call it the operant merry-go-round, because it's not a case of dismissing this or saying we shouldn't train or all the other things that I get accused of. You say people take to whatever they think of stuff. It is about recognizing that there is more stuff, and if we have that filter keep on going about, well, where does that sit on the quadrant, we're missing out on such a rich vein of other stuff. And actually, I think if we want to try and get best outcomes, we have to see beyond that. This is why you and I and Kim, we co-host Beyond the Operant. It's not instead of the operant, it's not get rid of the operant, it's beyond the operant, right? I think that's important.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Like, a couple of things are sort of woo to me. One of them is the quadrants aren't scientific. They didn't come from science. They're a way of explaining training methods, and somehow they've been twisted, I don't know how, but a long time ago, and everybody believes it, that they are scientific. And now, because people conduct studies based on the quadrants, the world thinks that therefore they are scientific because there are publications that reference the quadrants. But that's not primary referencing. That's just people deciding the quadrants are a thing, so I'm going to study them. Well, actually, the quadrants aren't a thing. They're just a way of explaining something. And actually, they don't even explain it the way it happens in the brain. So it's not that I think, you know, the quadrants are useless. I think some people find them useful for communicating with caregivers and communicating with people about, you know, training methods. And if they find them useful, then use them. I'm a big proponent of that. But I think a lot of people find them confusing. And the frustrating thing from a scientific perspective is a lot of people think they're real. They think that that's actually the way that the brain learns, is in 4 different ways. And it isn't. Like, no one's ever said that, because it's ridiculous to think that. Like, that's just not the way the brain is structured. And, you know, take the example, I think we've used this example before, but of teaching a dog to sit and rather than jump up when people come in through the door. And I appreciate that I wouldn't choose to do that as an exercise anyway, but lots of people do. And lots of people would say, well, we're giving food when the dog sits, and so therefore it's positive reinforcement training, and therefore it's kind training because it's a reward-based training, etc. But it actually misses the point that if we want to think about kind training methods, we have to think about how it leaves the dog feeling. So what's the internal state? What's the affective state of that dog? How does the dog feel about that interaction? Maybe it does feel, oh, great, I get treats for sitting when people come in the door. I'm not going to bother jumping up at them. I'm just going to eat my treats. Great. Then we've induced a positive affective state. So i.e. the dog feels good about that interaction. But actually, unfortunately, I think what happens in most cases is that we induce either frustration or anxiety. So either the dog's left with the same anxiety it had in the first place about the people coming through the door, but it has to sit still whilst it has that anxiety, potentially thereby increasing the anxiety for various reasons. So that's inducing a negative affective state, or actually the dog's just frustrated because now it has to sit still and it's desperate to be jumping around, etc. So again, we've introduced a negative affective state. So I think, I don't find the quadrants useful, but if people find them useful, great. But just remember that there is a risk when we're framing everything around that way of thinking, which is that we're missing the really important focus of that interaction, which is how was the dog left feeling? Because if we really want to focus on kind methods, and not everyone does, so I'm not speaking to those people who aren't interested in how their dogs feel, but if we really want to focus on kind training, kind interactions, and ensuring that, our dog's well-being and emotional state is maximized as much as it can, then we need to be thinking about how the dog's left feeling with that interaction, and not whether we added food, whether the behavior increased, decreased, all of that. That's not helpful. We need to look at what's happening in that interaction on a much more connected way.
This brings us to what we were talking about off air before we came on, about being more truthful with what we're doing and what we're seeing. Because I think, again, when we have a very operant view, if we're in that kind of mindset at the time, it does become quite task oriented. It becomes very functional, which is like, okay, I'm going to get my dog to settle on the mat when people come because that's better and the dog's happier and all this kind of thing. The more truthful way of looking at that is the dog is more compliant now, because they're doing something. I think just recognizing that, and that, I use the term relief a lot, as you know, thinking about the relief that we seek when we end up in an elevated state, or we end up having some kind of emotional process going on. We just have to ask ourselves, are we actually offering relief here, or are we just getting the dog to do something else instead?
Yeah, and what's the reason for doing that? And I think, absolutism isn't from one part of the community. I'm afraid we're all guilty of it, and there's absolutism in terms of, well, you can't possibly put your dog away because it might feel excluded, and that might be a negative affective state. Well, I don't really go along with that either. I live in a modern society, in a modern world, and my dogs live in that world with me. If I lived in the middle of nowhere, then maybe they would be able to have less constraints, and maybe they'd be able to not be in a negative affective state for some period of their lives. But actually, in a modern living situation in the middle of a city, there are times when, I'm sorry, but my dogs have to be shut away because they're just annoying, and I want to be able to have strangers in the house to look at the boiler, or whatever's going on. There are like a million examples I could use. And no, if I could wave a magic wand, I wouldn't have it be that way. But it is that way, and that's okay. I don't think we need to beat ourselves up about that day in, day out. So I think, again, it goes back to trying to take our pedal off the absolutism and the perfection that we want to create in our interactions with our dogs, and just say, what are we committed to? I am completely and utterly committed to my dogs having an opportunity to have a positive affective state throughout their lives. And they might dip in and out of bits of frustration, they might dip in and out of bits of any negative affect, but their background affective state should be positive, and that's what I'm committed to. And I will change my life to ensure that that is so, but that doesn't mean that every second of my dog's life is exactly the way they want it, because it isn't. And it doesn't mean that every behavior that they display is going to work in our household, because it isn't. So I will work tirelessly to make sure that we can live harmoniously together, but I really have huge compassion for people who are in that situation where sometimes that isn't the case. And I think, we have to remember that we don't live in a perfect world, and we have to be realistic about, what we're doing and why we're doing it. I think we were talking about the example of kind of operant conditioning. So I've got a puppy, and I do once every 2 to 4 weeks, I go to a trainer and we do some obedience work. So it's kind of classic operant conditioning training. It's sports dog work. I don't do that for my puppy. I do that for me. Now, my puppy enjoys it. And if my puppy doesn't enjoy it, then we will stop it. That I'm very clear about because of my commitment. But I'm not doing it because my puppy asked to go and do dog sports. I'm doing it because that's what I want to do, and I enjoy that interaction with my puppy and that journey with my puppy. So yeah, I think we just need to be able to be a bit more honest and not feel like the world's going to jump on us and criticize us for that. And you know, just accept that people are going to do things in slightly different ways, but let's look at what they're committed to, not just what they're doing. You know, there are extremes. Anyone who hits their dog, I'm going to have a conversation with them, because I'm not convinced that that's going to be the right thing to do. It might come from, I was frustrated, I didn't mean it, but I'm going to have a conversation with them. But in terms of tweaks of training methods and this and that and the other and which is best, most of the time we have no idea which is best, and which is best will differ depending on the individual circumstances and the dog that's involved. But if you remain committed to ensuring that each dog has a background positive affective state, then that's a really good place to start. You can't really go far wrong.
And that's the fundamental foundation that we all need to seek. And I think it does come back to this thing about being honest and being truthful about what's happening, and recognizing, you know, so if you've got a dog who does something like, I don't know, agility, and you think, yeah, my dog loves it, there has to be a question mark on that. I think because we don't know for sure how much of that dog enjoys it and how much of that dog is turning up because they want to, or how much they're turning up because they've just been so heavily connected to doing that activity. To say, like you said, well, actually I do agility because I like it. I like the fact that I get a chance to do an activity with my dog. It's away from the kids, it's away from the husband, or whatever it is. Then, like you say, that's okay, isn't it? And some people have very specific views about dog sports or elements of training or our relationships. Their views are also important, but we have to recognize that we're all in a different place on that journey with those relationships with our dogs, and it is multifactorial in as far as the human has their own emotional experience that is attached to that connection. You know, we both have puppies at the moment. You've got Zebedee, I've got Molly, and we've both done things very similarly in as far as, especially with Molly, because of she's a rescue pup, so she'd already had a bit of time somewhere else, and that wasn't a great time for her. So I had to kind of give her a chance to decompress when she first came here. And I think both of us have started the process by learning from our dog first, working out, who are you? How do you process stuff? What is it that you need to feel safe? And this thing about turning expectations full 180. So rather than us have an expectation on them, the expectation is on us when they're young. The expectation to keep them safe, to provide an environment so they can do predominantly environmental / experimental learning in a safe space. And this is something that both of us talk a lot about, this in regards to behaviors that have innate value to the dog, learning experiences that are authentic to the dog.
Yeah.
And recognizing the difference between that and a structured education where we're telling them to do something in a village hall. And we've got to recognize that some of that stuff, especially pre-12 months, is unlikely to have any internal value for that dog.
Yeah,
and that's possibly why they...
Yeah, I think a lot of the time the dogs grow up to be balanced and you know, have appropriate behavior despite what we've done during their puppyhoods, not because of it. I'm definitely a big flag flyer for the idea that socialization really isn't about taking your puppy out and exposing it to loads of things. It's like the worst thing in the world you can do to a developing brain. That socialization period is about the brain being incredibly sensitive to social interactions at that point because of the explosion of neuroplasticity. So there are still new cells being formed, thousands of new cells being formed, but also the cells that are being formed are either being killed, pruned, branched, moved. They're creating what that final structure will look like for social interactions at that period of time. And unfortunately, decades ago, somebody well-intentioned misinterpreted that as, okay, that's the period of time that we need to go out and create all of these connections with various different experiences because the brain will grow and the connections will grow. It was well-intentioned, but it was incorrect. So actually what we need to do during that period of brain development is protect the brain against negative experiences. The brain, as long as the puppy has, you know, a normal environment, whatever that is, that's probably another hour's worth of discussion on what normal environment is. But as long as the puppy is in, you know, a family that understands its needs, it's getting its needs met, and it's, you know, it's protected from unsafe situations, the puppy's brain during that period of time will develop perfectly well. There are enough social interactions with you, with your family, with your immediate friends that might come into contact with it. In my case, my puppy comes into contact with me and maybe one other person a week for a minute. And usually that's too much in my view. But it'll also come, my puppy will also come into contact with 3 other dogs because it lives with 3 other dogs. They all have very different needs, so it'll have very different social learning from those 3 different relationships. That's more than enough. If those interactions are protected so that they so that there's a focus on positive affect, so that there's no negative experience that happens there, the puppy doesn't become scared, the puppy doesn't have, I don't know, Nancy have a go at it in a disproportionate way. You know, as long as I'm there guiding those interactions and choosing at what point the puppy interacts in various different social situations, its brain will develop perfectly well. And the advantage of getting through the development stage without those negative experiences is that all the way through that, you're building the mechanisms of resilience. And resilience isn't like fluffy, cloudy in the Microsoft cloud or anything. Resilience is about what the environment for the neurons is created. So what does that look like within the brain? Which neurotransmitters are supported? Which chemicals, other chemicals, non-neurotransmitters are supported? What's the relative ratio of different supportive cells around the neurons? All of those things feed into these resilience mechanisms that are being built throughout this period of time. So yeah, my socialization for this puppy looked completely different to, for instance, my Rottweiler puppy that I had 20 years ago, which I did have a tick list, you know, must meet person in a motorbike helmet, must meet person on a bicycle. Like, it was kind of driving you crazy, right? Must say hello to people out in the park and keep all 4 legs on the ground. My puppy literally is not allowed to say hello to anyone. And there was a really good demonstration of why I do that the other day. Elliot's my partner, Elliot and I were outside the pub with Zebedee, and 2 very excited people came running up. Zebedee was being naughty. He was having fun. He was standing on the pub table, like surveying the universe. And I was letting him because we're outside, and you know.
And he follows his mum with that habit. Like,
yeah, I think so. Dancing on the table.
Yeah.
And 2 very excited people came bounding over. Can we say hello to your puppy? He's beautiful. And I said, oh, I'm really sorry, but you can't. He's learning that other people are not exciting and that I'm the center of his world, and that it's fine for other people to be chatting and dancing around, but they're nothing to do with him. And they stayed because they were asking me questions about that. Oh, I haven't really heard about that approach. And they were stood right next to him. So he was higher than the female of the pair because he was standing on the table. And they were talking really excitedly and using their arms and saying, he's so beautiful, and look at his coat. And at times they were staring at him. He didn't pay them any attention at all. He was perfectly comfortable in their presence. He was relaxed. He was happy. He would intermittently kind of sniff the table or nudge me, but he was perfectly calm. This is a 5-month-old German short-haired pointer from a working strain, so he's pretty energetic. And my partner Elliot said, do you never let people say hello to him? And I said, no. Did you see why? Because now I've got a puppy that doesn't think that other people are exciting, so I now don't have to teach him not to jump up at people. So
yeah,
sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say that's a really important point there, because I think when we think about some of the behaviors that we presume we have to train away, so jumping up, pulling on the leash, there's many. In my experience of working with clients and now with my own puppy, it's almost like the things that we do with that heavy training approach first is going to make jumping up and pulling more likely, and then we have to spend time to train those out.
Yeah.
Whereas with Molly, I learned very quickly that she has a real need to olfactorily process people. She likes processing. She doesn't like social engagement. And we've had the same thing. You know, some people don't even ask, right? They just come running over. But when people do, we're like, actually, we're training. Could you, you know, by all means say hi, but please don't pet her. And she's really good now at sniff and go, or no sniff and go, which is getting more likely now as she's getting a bit older. So she's like, actually, I don't. So if somebody does just come into her personal space and they haven't asked, and they're like, oh, puppy, that puppy brain kicks into gear now. She goes wriggly bummed, gets silly, jumps up a little bit. And if it continues too long, this was definitely the case when she first came, she'd go bitey, right? So this is similar to what you're saying there. And I think there's a few people in the group there talking about wanting to know more about this. And maybe this is something you and I could put together as a kind of a deep dive thing at some point, talking about our experiences with Zebedee and Molly, but also looking at the neuroscience. And I think that's something that people would really like to look at. So, and this is, yeah.
I was just going to say, in case it doesn't slot into anywhere else, that for me is the key. So my focus with Zebedee is creating a positive affective state. And we know from research that has now been replicated in dogs that a positive affective state is associated with appropriate behavioral choices and optimistic behavioral choices. So the affective state is directly influencing what behaviors we see displayed from the dog. And that's the focus, therefore, is the affective state. Zebedee then decides what he's going to do with the rest. But what we don't see are these intense behaviors that we have to correct, because they don't come from a positive affective state. Because if you have a positive affective state, you make good choices, you make optimistic choices, and you remain calm even under mild pressure. Like that's been shown in lots of different species at many different levels of analysis within neuroscience. So I think it's the same message that you were just giving there, which is that actually, if we focus on that, we then don't have behaviors to correct, because they don't actually get exhibited, or in the case where they're already exhibited, they naturally just disappear without us having to directly address them. And that's why it doesn't make sense to me to have an operant approach to behavior cases as being the first thing you pull out of the bag, because what you're saying is, I'm going to correct your behavior because the behavior is the problem. The behavior is a barometer for what's going on inside, and actually what needs addressing there is the affective state. So what's going on there? And I'm not saying it's easy, you know, with some cases it's really difficult, and genetics feeds into affective state, early life experience, trauma, all of those things. So, you know, it's not that just simply focusing on affective state is going to cure all dogs of serious behavioral problems. That's not what I'm saying. But I think knowing that and understanding that gives us a different approach, and a more, I would say, compassionate, connected approach to how we work with dogs, and particularly with puppies. I mean, in my case, I had a puppy with good genetics, good early life experience. If he was going to end up squiffy, it was going to be my fault. So, you know, there was literally nothing I needed to correct when he turned up on my doorstep. And with him, my only job is to protect him from negative experiences, because he will do the rest. I have taught him recall, and that's for safety. Perhaps if I lived in the middle of the nowhere, I wouldn't even do that. But in a city, it's really, really important. So his recall is spot on. And we work on that every day, and we do that through operant conditioning. So he gets lovely sausages and cheese for coming back when I blow the whistle, and he loves it. Well, he certainly looks like he loves it. He'll do a spin even if there's prey running right past his nose and come running back to me. But yeah, the rest of it, he's largely left to work out for himself, because I'm providing the platform for him to be able to do that.
And this is where we don't know. There's just not enough evidence for us to know this early creation of behaviors from a very young age. As soon as that puppy comes into our life that we're deciding we're going to get the dog to do this, do that, do the other, we just don't know enough about how much that will impair or impact on the natural, normal self-regulatory processes and natural learning that the dog also needs to do, which is actually authentic to them, and that element of resilience. I wrote a piece recently called "Whose Behavior Is It Anyway?" looking at that side of things, and maybe we do have an idea, because we look at children who have experienced trauma, who we find out when they're adults going through therapy, the added trauma when they're younger of having others try and control and change and coerce that behavior to fit into a conformed norm, without the kind of the relief that they were seeking or the ability that they need to process. There's also in the human psychology world, there has been studies done on children who have had more freedom regarding emotional outlets, whether that's through creativity or play, who are less likely to be dysregulating than children who are more contained or have expectations put on behavior. So I think, and I see this with Molly for sure, she's learning. I think there's this notion that if we're not teaching them something, they're not learning. Whereas Molly's learning tons. And when I do share Molly's story, which I'm going to be doing very soon, there is of course a big caveat there, is that Zebedee and Molly, they are their own dogs, and we both live in multi-dog households, which in my experience with Molly, Harley and Arthur, they're doing an amazing job with her, because I see her do that social learning all the time. We were talking earlier about some of the stuff she's picking up isn't always great from my point of view, but she thinks this is cool. But the most important thing is having some faith in Mother Nature a little bit, about recognizing that she's got the right neurology to deal with what she needs to deal with during those points in development. It's up to us, because obviously we're replacing the mom, to make sure the environment allows that opportunity for that safe, natural learning, often through play or through adventuring and experiencing and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and as soon as we get involved, we're introducing a variable that quite frankly gets things wrong a lot of the time. And within structured scientific environments, it's well known that the quickest way to get animals to learn is to get the human out. So you automate the learning process, because humans always bring bias and they always mess things up and increase variability. We do that with our training. And that's okay to be honest about that. We are human. We are always going to get it slightly wrong and introduce variability. But yeah, like you said, there's a lot that we don't need to teach them. And we don't need to be actively teaching them for them to learn. They don't need to be learning to be alive. This idea that they're constantly learning, that I've even heard very experienced leaders within the field say, every single interaction is reward based, whether it's an internal reward or an external reward, it's based on operant conditioning. Well, that's preposterous, because that's to say that 24 hours a day we're learning. That's economically impossible for our brains. It just doesn't happen. Learning is a small proportion of what we do. And what's the purpose of learning? The purpose of learning ultimately is to automate things so that it's less costly for our brain in terms of energy. So it's ridiculous to say that we would learn something and then keep learning it again and again and again and again, because there'd be absolutely no point learning it in the first place. Sure, you can practice something, you can refresh something, but actually the purpose of learning, bearing in mind that, ethologically, we don't need to learn how to run an A-frame or, how to do perfect heel work. The purpose of learning is actually to automate things so that we reduce the energy demand on our brains. So it's a small proportion of what we do. And we all know how energy draining it is, because your brains are probably thinking, God, I could do with a cup of tea now. She didn't have to go on, doesn't she? Even just paying attention to an hour's worth of conversation is energetically draining. So no, not all behavior is based on learning. Only a very small proportion of behavior is based on learning. And to create an environment for a dog where the focus is learning all the time is quite frankly exhausting for our dogs.
Well, trust you to throw that in just as we come to the end of our hour, because oh my god, that's just so much stuff. But just kind of briefly and compacting it in, this is really important, Kathy, because this notion of what we intrinsically internally have value to regarding learning We all know from our school days how much we had to learn stuff that we weren't particularly interested in, we didn't have value in, we had to do repetitions, trying to cram it in, and actually ultimately how little use that had to us in the future, where whilst around us in that educational setting of school, the brain is seeking stuff that would have value.
Yeah.
How do I feel about my relationship with my peers? How do I feel about my relationship with authority? How do I feel safe in this environment? All those kind of things. And
how to climb a tree. Let's face it, we don't do enough of that when we're kids
exactly.
anymore.
Well, that's, I think having Rachel, our friend Rachel Meadows, of course, is she talks so eloquently about why she homeschools Reuben and why she's moved away from that structured system to allow him to grow and learn in an authentic way through play and experiences and all these kind of things. But this is really important. This is what you and I are trying to do with our pups, right? Is to allow enough space without us muddying the waters by us deciding what we think they're going to learn, that is invariably going to have no value. And for a lot of dogs, they've forgotten it by the time they get through adolescence anyway. And we've got to kind of go back and kind of keep trying to cram that stuff in. But I think about internal value is really important, I think. And another thing that gets said, of course, is that everything is somehow, like you said earlier, reinforcing or punishing all the time. Again, there is that what we experience through that experimental learning that will invariably have value, which is different to having things done artificially, artificially corrected or artificially created. And this is a big area for us to get our head around, I think. With training.
Yeah, for sure. And, I've said it a million times before, but people still don't believe me. We've shown time and time again that the reward network within the brain is a very specific network, and no, it is not lit up and active in every interaction and every behavior. It's very specific, and that's okay. It's okay. And it was okay that 70 years ago, when people like Thorndike and Skinner did their original experiments, that they were super excited about them, because they had managed to distill down something that until that time hadn't really been accessible into an experimental protocol that was now very easy to understand. So it was landmark, but it was landmark, let's leave it there. It's one part of how the brain functions. The rest of the world has moved on. The rest of society has moved on. The dog world can too. And, we know this just from thinking about our own experiences. Like, I've had a powerful personal experience recently. I've fallen in love, and I can tell you my affective state has changed for sure. And physiologically it's changed. My responses to hormones have changed. My behavior's definitely changed. And as one simple example, I had a week last week that was so awful. I'm lucky I didn't stab someone. I seemed to be a flypaper for idiots last week. Now, usually that would leave me in a rage for ages and probably mean that I had to reach out to someone for coaching just to bring me back off the ledge. But I'm in a positive affective state. Did I enter a negative affective state during dealing with that? Yes, I did. Did I get angry? Yes, I did. Did I recover much more quickly? Oh, yes, I did. Did I get perspective much more quickly? Oh, yes, I did. So that's the value of having a positive affective state, is that without reward or punishment, your behaviors are different. Why? Because of what we were talking about: internal value, perspective, and optimism.
So, that brings us up to the end of the hour, I think. It's flown by, hasn't it? It's really flown by. There's something I was going to ask you, and I can't remember what it was. It might come to me in a moment. But so there's loads of really good questions actually from this chat. So if you do have time later, if you want to pop in and say hi to a few things, if you want to. I think it's definitely got people thinking. I think that's the whole point. Shay does sum it up quite well, which is stunningly fabulous conversation. As always, I disagree with half of it, but I do so with a smile on my face and a spark in my brain. Fascinating subject I could listen to for hours. I think that's the whole nature of these discussions, isn't it? And I think I've said in a piece recently, we should all feel challenged through this, but not threatened. I think that's the point, and take away what we need for our own truths. I think that's the important side of it, and ultimately
the world would be a boring place if we all agreed about everything all of the time.
And this is the fascinating thing for me, and this is why I love it so much, about talking in terms of the emotional experience. Because as I say, we all have one, but they all will be unique and individual to us. And how we process things and what we add value to things and how we perceive things. And especially, you know, you and I did the Victoria Steel conference last year together, with kind of talking about the beyond the operant. I did more of a philosophical side of it. You did the neuroscience side of it. And mine was very much framed around looking at behavior as the behavior we judge in others and the behavior we do ourselves, because those two sides of the coin give us more of a foundational reality to what behavior is. It is ultimately an expression of self, and as you mentioned there, that self can change and does change. And just you having this wonderful, nice kind of honeymoon period of new romance, and that it changes outlooks, and it means that you add new value to new things, and you will be affected by things differently. And it's just recognizing that our dogs will be experiencing something similar, and especially as professionals, we have to be more mindful of what dog's turning up today, because we have the arbitrary thing in the diary, meeting client tomorrow, 10 o'clock. I've already got a view in my head about what we're going to do, but I have to check in with that dog to see what their affective state is at that moment, and what their mood's like, and what they're able to do, and what's going to be good for, what's going to be valuable for them. So tell us then, Kathy, before we say goodbye, about some of the things that are coming up, so people can get more Kathy, because we all need more Kathy, right?
So we've got a deep dive that I'm really excited about coming up in December. So I think 5th of December, should be on the Barking Brains Facebook page. And that's with Hannah Capon and Bobby Banbury. So that's looking at pain and behavior. So some of the neural mechanisms of pain and separating out acute and chronic pain and how they differentially affect behavior, mood, affective state, and some cases where they presented as behavioral cases, but actually the underlying influence on affective state was pain, because pain is known to cause negative affective state and therefore lead to behavioral problems that may be picked up as behavioral problems, but actually pain might be underlying it. So that's really exciting. And I think if, you know, there are lots of different directions that could go in, so we may well be doing more next year. And then other than that, we've got a few dates in the diary for Scent and Science, which is with Elliot, Connor and I, my partner, the one that I fell in love with. So we're doing in-person workshops. He is a search and rescue trainer and scent detection, qualified scent detection trainer. So the first ones that we've got booked are scent detection, various locations all around the UK. And if anyone wants to host us, just get in touch. So he provides one-to-one training with a small group of people, and I provide neuroscientific information. So I do a talk at the beginning that's kind of general around the neuroscience of scent work or scent detection, depending on what we're doing. But then follow each dog and carer throughout the day, looking at their relationship, the way that the dog works, and then giving a kind of summary at the end about the neuroscientific underpinnings of that pairing, and how, if any tips or papers that I think might be interesting for moving forward with that dog's work. So yeah, we've got a few of those in the diary, so keep an eye on the Barking Brains page if you're interested in coming along to one of those.
Yeah, definitely look at Barking Brains, but I will make sure we put something in the group. If you could share this stuff in the group as these events come up, Kathy, you know, promo them in the group, that'd be amazing. Wow, so that's been amazing. Thank you so much, Kathy. I really appreciate you coming in today, and I knew it was going to be awesome, and how awesome it was, right? Looking at all the amazing messages in the group as well, just to let people know, if you kind of come in later in, it'll be in the group anyway. Also, I'll upload this to the Dog Centre Care YouTube channel. Next Saturday, we have the amazing Dawn Allen. I'm going to put the event up today for that. So just to kind of remind you, but Dawn Allen's come to join us next Saturday at 4 o'clock. We've got lots of other talks coming up soon. I did a little post on that the day for you to have a look at. Also, just a little plug on this, I've got a new little series of talks where I'm going to be speaking to people from lots of different and diverse backgrounds who are involved in dog training. They could be dog trainers. Some of them are vets, different people. It's called the Ask series. So Ask is always seek knowledge, and it's about us hearing from other people about their stories, their challenges, their experiences. so that can better inform our own emotional experience and our own worldview. Because, you know, back in the old days, Kathy, we'd all sit around a fire, right, or sit in the pub, and we'd listen to people's stories, and it helps us to understand better by sharing experiences. And I've got the most amazing Rachel Forday as the first guest, and she's going to be telling us about her transition over to the UK from Singapore, and her working as a dog trainer, and her experiences as an Asian lady dog trainer. And it's a powerful chat, and we've got other ones lined up from different people. So that's coming up soon. I'll share it in the Dog Centre Care Group. Anything you want to say, Kathy, before we go?
Thanks for having me.
Oh, God, bless you.
And hello to everyone out there. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, thanks for everybody who's listening in, and yeah, speak to you all soon. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.